I want to welcome you all. I think I know everyone. I'm Nikki Fresh, Director of Development for Hartley House, and I'm so happy that you were able to join us for this third Healing Hearts briefing. Let's see, we're going to record the session. So we're going to jump in a second, but before we do, I just want to say that we're going to talk about our medical accompaniment program. And the medical advocates are called on in the immediate aftermath of a sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, or child abuse incident. So the physical and emotional wounds are really raw and in need of triage. So before we move into the briefing, I just want to make sure that we know that this is one of the most difficult parts of our work, and the conversation can be difficult to hear and to talk about. And so if any time in the briefing you feel overwhelmed or you have an intense emotions coming up, please feel free to log off or turn off your screen or take a break, and know that our 24-hour hotline is here for you as well. And that number, Jen is going to put up in the chat for us. So just in case anyone needs it. But again, our work isn't easy to talk about, and the fact that you're here is really important, and we want to honor that, and we also want to let you know that it's okay if you need to step away. Before I introduce Shannon Jones, our Director of Hartley House Crisis Services, please welcome our President and Executive Director, Dr. Inga James. She's going to talk a little bit about the program and put things in context for us. Good morning, Inga. Can't hear you.
Somebody said I'm going to have "you're muted" on my tombstone. So, thank you, Nikki, and welcome everybody, and thank you for coming. I just want to reiterate what Nikki said, that this is a difficult topic, and just be aware of your own reactions, please. I want to start just talking a little bit about the Hartley House overview, where we are now. At the beginning of this fiscal year, which was July, we had 6 departments. We had our residential department, which is not just our shelter, but we also help our residents find permanent housing, working with landlords and such. And we also provide rental assistance. So we help in not just in our shelter, but also after leaving the shelter. We have our crisis program, which contains several programs, including our lethality assessment program and the medical accompaniment program that we'll talk about today. We also have a clinical department, which provides professional counseling, but also oversees our abuse intervention program, which is a group type program. It's psychoeducational. It's a 26-week program, and we hold it twice a year. We have our legal department, of course, which provides not only representation, legal representation, but also advocacy and accompaniment to court hearings. And then we have our prevention and community engagement department, which is focused highly on bringing together allies and champions in the work that we do to spread the word, make it more grassroots, getting down to the community level, which is very exciting. And then the 6th is the admin department. We're the supportive services. We're the ones who make sure that the services are paid for, resourced, maintained. And of course, that includes the development department, finance department, our grants management, and then the executive level. In August, though, we formed a new department called our Department of Community-Based Services. And I just want to let you know that I have never spoken of this in public. This has been an aspiration of mine for many years, to be able to take our services out to the community. And leave Frederick City centric services behind so that we can actually provide the services for some of those that are just not able to get to Frederick, not interested in coming to Frederick, or whatever other reason they have. So we're starting with a program in partnership with the Housing Authority of the City of Frederick. And it's going to happen at Lucas Village, where we're going to place a domestic violence advocate in Lucas Village to meet with people in that housing complex, which is run by the Housing Authority, on a face-to-face basis. So we're actually putting an advocate in that community. It's a best practice, and it is something that I know the Housing Authority has been attempting to address for a very long time, because domestic violence is one of the biggest challenges that they have with the families that live in their complexes. So we've started training the staff about the red flags of domestic violence, the Housing Authority staff, that is, mandatory child abuse reporting laws, and just bringing them up to speed with regards to knowledge about domestic violence and sexual assault. And in January, we'll actually have a service coordinator there to start meeting with people, make referrals, and provide education about domestic violence, about resources in the area, and to do a fair amount of crisis intervention we're expecting. So that is very exciting, and something that, like I said, I've been working on that one for several years, trying to get funding for it. And it's just been a confluence of good fortune for us to be able to start this new department. Once we get Lucas Village on its way, we will continue soliciting funding to begin satellite offices outside of Frederick City, so that somebody who lives in Emmitsburg doesn't have to drive to Frederick City to get the kind of crisis intervention services that you can get here. We are also looking in either the second or third year of this program to provide a legal advocate and a professional counselor to the roster of these satellite offices. And so people will travel from office to office, being able to provide services at each one, at least one, maybe 1.5 days a week. So that's all exciting. And it's something that I think is really going to benefit the community. And we have a lot of community support and people that are supporting us on these efforts. But let's talk about the medical accompaniment program. It is a program of the crisis department, which is overseen by Shannon Jones, and you'll hear more from her today. And it's a 24-hour response. So we answer calls to the medical accompaniment program 24 hours and report to the hospital, Frederick Health Hospital, within 1 hour of our receiving the call. So what happens is when a victim goes to Frederick Hospital for a forensic examination because they've been assaulted, whether it's sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, or child abuse, if they go to the hospital calls us, and we send an advocate to sit with that person and help that person get through a very intrusive and difficult examination, because the purpose of the examination is not only to make sure that the victim is well and is not needing medical attention, but it's also to collect evidence. And that's kind of a brutal process. So we stay for the entire process. Once we get to the hospital, it is 4 to 5 and can go up to 6 hours that they're in the emergency department getting this examination done. We provide advocacy and education. We explain to them what's going on, what's happening, what's coming next. We explain to them that they're able to deny any further activity, that they can decline to participate anymore at any time. And we explain to them what their options are. We also help the nurse explain what the procedures are, because every person who is taken into the forensic unit at the emergency department is seen by a forensic nurse. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And we want to make sure that the process works in the victim's time, not in the professional's time, so that that victim feels in as much control as possible. And there's no pressure to do one thing or another. We work under the empowerment model, so we never tell a person what to do. We give them options. We talk about consequences and let them make their own decision, because they know what's best for themselves. We also work with law enforcement, because if the victim is interested in reporting the assault, then law enforcement will be called, and they'll do an interview right there at the hospital. And we can accompany them to that interview if they want us, and help make sure that it's a victim-centric process, and that the person is not being re-traumatized. We also work very closely with the forensic nurses who have been highly trained in how to take evidence from a person's body and how to maintain it. And it's a rough job. Burnout is pretty high. They see some pretty terrible things. But we work very closely with them to explain the procedures and ensure that the medical team also knows of any injuries, because sometimes victims are hesitant to talk about their injuries. And a few years ago, the hospital was able to raise funds in order to create a suite for the forensic examination. So it's not in the cold, sterile emergency department. It's in a suite that's more friendly, more comfortable for friends or family to wait. It's much more trauma informed than the emergency department. So they do have a little bit of a more comfortable examination than somebody in the emergency department would. We've been doing sexual assault forensic exam accompaniment since the early 90s, which is when they really started to become a best practice. And so we were responding to sexual assault cases for the last 30 years. But in 2018, we were able to bring in enough funding to be able to respond to domestic violence cases too. So that we are now responding not only to sexual assault, but also domestic violence. And in 2019, we added human trafficking. So we now see all victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking, and child abuse, which is usually sexual abuse, in the hospital to provide these advocacy services. We cover 24/7. So the number of optimal medical accompaniment advocates is about 12. That helps us cover the entire month. And so that nobody's on a really heavy rotation. Our advocates are highly trained. So not only do they come to us generally with a bachelor's degree in psychology, sociology, social work, those kinds of things, but we give them about 175 more hours of training in this difficult job that they've got to do. They go through our routine 30 hours of agency training that all new staff get, which provides detailed information about our services, talks about how to assess for suicide, does education on domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and human trafficking. and introduces them kind of to the world of crisis work. And then they go to 120 hours of crisis worker hotline training. So they actually have to work on the hotline for 120 hours before they can move forward. After that, then there's 8 hours of training from our team members, which includes Frederick Police Department, the FHH forensic nurse, the Fort Detrick Sharp lead, and people within our organization who are experts in the medical accompaniment field. And then they have to shadow 2 or 3 cases. So they have to show up when a call comes out in order to be an apprentice. And then after that, they can go solo. So it's not a minor commitment, even just getting ready to take cases. When COVID hit, I should tell you, we probably had about, before COVID, I would say, trying to remember that far back, 8 to 12 a month of medical accompaniments. When COVID happened and there were so many restrictions, we had to withdraw from the hospital, and we did not provide these accompaniment services. The hospital handled all of the work that we had been doing without us, but they would send us they would make referrals after or during the exam with the consent of the victim. And so they would call us and make a referral, and we would do the follow-up work. But when processes change, not everybody is in the know. We didn't get as many referrals as we would have liked. And so, we worked really hard to get back into the hospital earlier this year. One of the other things that happened with regard to COVID is victims were afraid to go to the hospital. So there were fewer victims getting exams especially during the very beginning of COVID, because people were afraid to go to the hospital. We're about back to pre-COVID times now, where we're seeing those 8 to 12 a month. And they're running about half domestic violence, half sexual assault, with a human trafficking case thrown in there. What we found during COVID from an organizational perspective is we found an increase in the severity of injuries, with more broken bones, more strangulation, more weapons being used. And we also have been experiencing an increase in child abuse reports to CPS, because more people are telling us about the abuse in their family. And we've seen an increase in requests for legal services and the need for protection orders and peace orders. And I think that has to do with with COVID getting, with the injuries being so severe that we're seeing, that people are being harmed even more greatly in their home than before COVID, and feel the need that they have to get out. And so they're seeking legal protection. And so we've seen a great increase in those requests for services. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Nikki to introduce the next phase of our briefing.
So now I want to introduce you to Shannon Jones. And Shannon has, let me tell you a little bit about her, because it's always good to know kind of how people come into a position. Shannon has a bachelor's degree in family studies from the University of Maryland. She supervises the 4 programs Inga just mentioned under the umbrella of the crisis department. So that's the 24-hour hotline, the medical accompaniment program we're talking about today, lethality assessment program, which we'll talk about at another briefing, and the PREA program, and PREA stands for Prison Rape Elimination Act. All 4 of those programs have frontline staff that are really the entryway into services at Hartley House. Her staff deal with the highest level of crisis, and most clients present when they initially engage with services. So Shannon, tell us a little bit more about yourself. You've been at Hartley House for quite some time. Where did you start out?
Hi, everyone, by the way. Yeah, so I've been with Hartley House for 14 and a half years. And I started out as a crisis worker, actually on the hotline, and as a medical accompaniment advocate. I moved into the lead crisis worker position and then ended up transferring departments and got my hands into some legal work as a victim advocate for a few years. After being in that position for about 4 years, the director of crisis services became available. So I decided to go back to my roots where I originally started, and I've been holding this position now for about 5 years.
So tell me what drew you to this work and what keeps you here? You started out in the most difficult position, the crisis worker position, and medical accompaniment. So why this work, and how do you continue to do it?
So I've always had a passion and just kind of natural tendencies for helping people. That's always just come very naturally to me, and that's what feels good. That's what brings me happiness and joy. I've also had several family members who have experienced abuse. So like many of us, I think that are in this work, the work's very personal for me as well. And I would say what keeps me going in this work now at my position that I'm in now is really my staff. I feel like they're really the heart of this work. I see the difference that they make in the work that they do daily, and my favorite thing to do is to teach and support. So I feel very lucky to be able to do that with them every day.
That's amazing. So today, like, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one of our clients, and this, of course, the names and everything's been changed, so it's confidential information. But so today we're going to talk about Caitlin. And Caitlin received a number of services from Hartley House, but it all began with a call to the hotline. So tell us about that call, Shannon.
Sure. So when Caitlin called for the first time, she shared with us that she was a victim of rape. And I'll share just a little bit about the incident that she shared with us, just to give you a little bit of history. So Caitlin's partner of about 3 months had an alcohol addiction, which she didn't initially know when the relationship started. One night they went out, had a few drinks. When they returned home, Caitlin decided to go to bed. Her partner stayed up and continued to drink. After about an hour of Caitlin sleeping, her partner came into the room yelling. Caitlin asked him to leave the room. Her partner did not leave the room. He then jumped onto the bed, got on top of Caitlin, put his hands around her neck, and began strangling her. He continued yelling at her during this entire strangulation, eventually let go of her neck, and then proceeded to pull her clothes off and rape her. So a few days after the assault is when Caitlin decided to call Hartley House hotline. And after she shared her story with our hotline staff member, they expressed concern to Caitlin about the possible injuries that she has from the assault. They shared information about the medical accompaniment program and encouraged her to go to the hospital to get both medical attention and evidence collection through a forensic exam. And after a good amount of encouragement, Caitlin agreed to go to the hospital.
So why do you think that she didn't call right away? And how did she know to contact us?
So Caitlin saw one of our pamphlets in her employee lounge at work, and she saw that we had a 24-hour hotline and decided to call when she saw that. But it is typical for a sexual assault survivor, especially, to take a few days after the assault to actually reach out to someone. Sometimes it takes a whole lot longer than a few days. Sometimes it takes years for people. But luckily, Caitlin decided at that point that she would reach out and try to get some help she needed. When she did initially reach out to us, she did share that she felt like she was falling apart. She wasn't sure what to do next. So when she called us, she was looking for guidance at that point.
And so during the call, she talked about what had happened, and it's already been several days since the incident. So part of going to the hospital is evidence collection. But what kind of a window of time is there if time had already gone by? And I also wondered what made the crisis worker concerned about her injuries?
Mhm. So Caitlin was still in the window of time to collect evidence. Because Caitlin disclosed that she was strangled, that's an immediate red flag for needing medical attention. Strangulation can cause medical issues for months and even years after it occurs.
Really?
Large medical issues such as a stroke or neurological issues. So because most injuries from strangulation are internal injuries, many people don't think to go get immediate medical attention because they're not seeing those injuries externally. So anytime that a strangulation is disclosed, we always encourage not only a forensic exam, but also immediate medical attention. Our advocates, while at the medical accompaniment, specifically advocate for a CT scan to be completed anytime a client discloses strangulation. That's one of the best ways to find internal injuries from a strangulation.
And be able to address them more quickly.
Yes.
So we talked about filing a report. What does that involve? What does it filing a, I'm presuming that's a police report. What does that involve?
So if they decide to actually file a report, a law enforcement detective will come to the hospital during the forensic exam and do an actual interview with the victim. The victim, law enforcement detective, the forensic nurse, as well as our advocate will all sit together in the comfort room at the forensic suite. And the detective does most of the talking as far as asking questions. The interview can take anywhere from 20 to 60 minutes, really depending on how much trauma that victim's experiencing in the moment, how many times we may need to take breaks and give them a few moments. After the interview, the victim then completes a written statement, and that kind of completes the immediate law enforcement report. And then from there, basically, law enforcement could do multiple different things. So they may decide to make an immediate arrest if there's enough evidence. They may decide to begin an investigation involving collecting more evidence or statements, or they may decide we're just going to take this back to the office, talk it over with our supervisor, see if we should move forward, making an investigation. So it could end in many different ways.
And what if Caitlin didn't want to make a report? Is that okay?
It is, yeah. So the other option is that she could file an anonymous report. And basically what that entails is there's still a physical exam that's still completed, collecting physical evidence. The forensic nurse still completes an interview with the victim, so still asks questions, gathers information. The victim still completes a written statement. And typically our advocate will kind of help the victim with that written statement because they have to actually write it out themselves. So we offer support throughout that because that's a tough thing for them to do. And law enforcement just isn't involved at all. So once we collect all of that information, the physical evidence, the interview questions, the statement, all of that evidence is then placed into a kit and taken to whatever local law enforcement jurisdiction it falls under, and they keep it in a secure facility.
And how long do they keep it?
So they'll actually keep it for 20 years because at that point, Caitlin could have 20 years to decide if she wanted to make a report and move forward with a criminal case.
Okay. So how did this work? So Caitlin called and talked to Crisis. Crisis encouraged her to go to the hospital. Then does Crisis call a medical accompaniment advocate right then? How does that communication work? How quickly does that happen?
So we typically don't call in an advocate just yet because we want to really match our time with both the victim when they arrive at the hospital and the forensic nurse, law enforcement, all of that. So we really work together closely with them to coordinate our times. So typically what happens is as soon as I'll kind of bring it back to Caitlin's story. So when Caitlin arrived at the hospital and disclosed that she was assaulted, the triage nurse took Caitlin to the forensic suite and called both the forensic nurse and our hotline to request an advocate. And that's typically how it happens. So whoever, whether it's the triage nurse or the forensic nurse, if they're already at the hospital, sometimes it plays out just a little bit differently as far as who calls us. But we always get the call and then respond within 60 minutes. And within that first 60 minutes of them, our advocates being on the way to the hospital, they will typically call the forensic nurse hotline and connect with that forensic nurse before they arrive, just to basically make sure that we're collaborating times, everybody's on the same page, we know where they're located, if they're still in the emergency department or the forensic suite, just to get a little bit of information before we head in.
So then how prepared is that staff person, is that advocate? What do they know about the situation when they're called to go to the hospital?
So barely anything. Our advocates kind of have to be prepared for nothing and everything all at the same time. So when they arrive, they have very limited information. Mainly what we know is if it's either a physical assault or a sexual assault. We'll know the age, the gender, and the primary language of the victim, and which forensic nurse is responding for the case. And that's pretty much it. We don't ever know anything about the incident that occurred. We don't always know if law enforcement's involved yet. We don't know if it's going to be a reporting or an anonymous report. So there's lots of things that they walk into just kind of blind.
Wow. So this is a really intimate and difficult situation for the victim. And I can only imagine for the MA as well. So how does the MA help? So what would a client expect? What would Caitlin expect when the advocate arrives?
So the advocate is really there for whatever type of support the victim needs in the moment. So what they can expect is our advocate to basically always ask for permission to be there with them, ask for consent through all the different parts of the entire forensic exam and the interview to make sure that they're still okay with us being present and hearing certain detailed information. Our advocates provide lots of education about what the victim's going to experience during the exam. They also provide lots of education for longer term healing, like the healing process and what they're going to be experiencing when they leave the hospital. They offer coping skills and grounding techniques for the client to use. They create a safety plan with the victim in order to make sure that they leave feeling as safe as possible, emotionally and physically, at least for the next 24 hours. We also, as Inga had mentioned, we talk about services. We offer other local resources that we may notice that they might be in need of. And then we do.
I'm sorry. So in Caitlin's situation, what happened when the advocate got there? What happened next?
So basically when they first arrive, we just introduce ourselves, let them know what our organization does. We share a confidentiality policy so that they feel safe and comfortable about us, not sharing information. And again, just make sure that that they're comfortable with us being there. So at that point, Caitlin did agree to it and did actually agree to us being present for all parts of the exam and the interview, which was really, really good. I'm glad for, because Caitlin also had several mental health issues that, for example, she had several panic attacks throughout the interview process. Definitely had a few moments during the physical exam in which our advocate had to stop the process and advocate for that with law enforcement, that, law enforcement's there on a mission. to do a job and ask questions, and they're not necessarily paying attention to the body language, the heavy breathing, the facial expressions. They're just kind of focused on what their goal is. But our goal as an advocate is to be able to pay attention to those things and give that victim, a voice when they don't have it themselves, and say, hey, can we stop for a few minutes and give this victim some time.
So this sounds like for the advocate, this is a really difficult situation as well. How do our advocates cope? How do we train them to cope in these situations?
So yes, you're right. So our advocates, this is a really difficult position in general because they have to have so much knowledge and education around what they're dealing with. They have to be prepared for just about anything during these cases. Every single case and story is completely different. We never walk into something that would be quote unquote normal. For one of these cases, they're always so different. And they're hearing some of the hardest incidents of violence imaginable and still have to remain that calm and safe presence that the victim so desperately needs in that moment. So a few things that our advocates do is we really help them learn how to compartmentalize things during the whole exam and interview process, during the entire forensic exam. But we also always encourage doing things like giving themselves breaks. If there's a moment where the victim isn't needing them, we encourage them to step out, do some deep breathing or coping, grounding techniques for themselves. So even the things that we're teaching and talking with our victims about, we're also having our staff do as well, so that they're feeling calm and able to do what they need to do. But there's also lots of other ways of support that we offer them. So between myself and the medical accompaniment coordinator, we're on call for staff 24/7. So if they need to debrief after a case, it doesn't matter what time it is, 2 a.m., 3 p.m., it doesn't matter what time, they're able to call us and process what they saw, what they heard before they actually step back into their home with their families. We want them to be able to process that before they move back into their normal daily lives. So we offer that. We also have regularly scheduled supervisions and team meetings so that we can also all come together and support one another. We discuss and encourage self-care at almost every single meeting that we have. And our agency also offers what we call a meeting place that staff can attend once a month to discuss any kind of feelings of burnout, vicarious trauma from the work that they do every day. So I think that with all these different forms of support, it does help them to feel a little bit more resilient to keep doing the work they're doing.
Right. So now with Caitlin, in Caitlin's instance, she got through the exam. Our advocate was there with her to help her. And then what happens next? How does the advocate know that our client is going to be safe? How do they know where to go next? Do they go to the shelter? Do they go back home? How does that work?
So every situation, again, is a little bit different. For Caitlin, she did decide to return home after leaving the hospital. So her and the advocate did create a pretty detailed safety plan for over the next 24 hours. In other situations, the client may choose to potentially go to a family or friend's house for the night. They may decide to request shelter and stay with us at Hartley House. If that does happen, our advocate will help coordinate that shelter request and any transportation if they need to get into shelter. So again, every situation is a little bit different, and we just really create that safety plan individually for every single person that we meet with.
And then do we follow up with the clients? Do we know what happened next for Caitlin?
Yes, we do. So 24 hours after the accompaniment, our staff does an outreach call to that client. And then after that, we also do additional outreach calls to the client 2 weeks after the accompaniment, and then again 1 month after the accompaniment. Something that we learned through surveys and through internal program evaluation is that we have more success, especially with sexual assault survivors, getting them engaged in services after they have a few weeks or even months following the assault. So after that amount of time, they're not necessarily in what we call trauma brain. So when they're in trauma brain, they're usually in survival mode. So they're just trying to keep their heads above water, which means they're not oftentimes willing or wanting to take the step to get additional support and engage in services just yet. So sometimes they're immediately ready, sometimes they aren't. But by doing several follow-up calls to them at different times, we have more chance of getting them engaged in the services that they need.
So did Caitlin end up using additional services at Hartley House?
She did, yes. So she ended up using our legal department and filing a protective order, and did get that protective order granted. She also engaged in support group, and I believe is still actively utilizing that service.
It's good to know, because
Yeah.
the healing takes a long time. It's not a,
It does. It's
When it's
lifelong for sure.
yeah. Well, thank you, Shannon. I wondered now if anyone has any questions, if anyone wants to, if anything from the story made you wonder something. It's a good time to ask. Caitlin, I'm sorry, Shannon or Inga.
I have a question.
Yes.
Shannon, you talked about the advocate advocating for a CT scan when there's been strangulation involved with the victim. Has the advocate run into a lot of, or any kind of resistance to that, or are the medical providers pretty on board with it? Because I know it has to be ordered.
Yeah, good question. So they, at this point in time, they're pretty on board with it. When we first started diving into strangulation education, I'd probably say about 2 to 3 years ago, when it really became a big research topic, it was a lot harder and we had to advocate a whole lot more. But we especially have the forensic nurses on our side now because they're so knowledgeable on what's best for the victim. So between us and the forensic nurse, it's really easy at this point to get one.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Sam.
Yes, thank you very much, Shannon. That was a great
Sure.
presentation. When a victim comes in to the hospital like that, under those circumstances, there must be a lot of confusion as to who is who, and who's offering what, and what's the difference between you, Hartley House, with a medical assistant coordinator and forensic nurse, and
Mhm.
so how does that sort of sort itself out? How does that sort of, they figure out, okay, this person is going to help me with this, and this person is going to help me with that. How does that go?
Yeah, so good question. So a lot of times when we all first introduce ourselves, we try to spend at least a few minutes with that individual so that they do kind of start feeling comfortable with us, start building rapport and connection with us individually. And then for the majority of the rest of the exam process, we make sure that we present as a team. But typically the advocate is always the one that's right next to the victim. So what's good for us and our team is that they know who we are, and they know that if they do have confusion about who else is in the room or why they're in the room, they can turn to us and say, who's this person and what are they here for? Why are they talking? And that's kind of what we serve as well.
Let me follow up on that. Do you all do much training with the forensic nurses? I mean, for instance, listening to Inga speak, there was a year during the COVID circumstance where you all weren't in the room. So how did the forensic nurses, how were they able to do your job or help with that portion of it?
So during that time, they always had to have another nurse, just usually it was an ED nurse that was in the room with them. And they would just kind of serve as a second body. And this is the way that the forensic nurses kind of explained it to us, is that they weren't necessarily filling our role as far as advocacy and support, but they were there to somewhat support the other forensic nurse, which is why we started having, we kind of created the protocol for them to call us during the exam so that we could still talk with that victim, provide support and education, for sure, safety planning. So we would still do a lot of the work, but it still wasn't as personal and as easy to connect with that victim during that time.
And that was when we weren't able to go into the hospital. It wasn't a choice for us not to go. It was the hospital was closed to anyone except for COVID. So that was a really difficult time, but we used telephone. Did we do FaceTime, that kind of thing?
We didn't, just because the nurses didn't necessarily have access to that. And it just didn't fit in with timing because, you know, when they're doing things, they're kind of moving through as quickly as possible. And even with moving quickly, this whole process typically does take about 6 hours and sometimes longer. So that was one thing we just didn't want to add to the timeline to make it longer for the victims.
Right.
So I just wanted to ask, there's always cost associated with a hospital visit. So I'm sure that is a burden on our victims, our survivors. So how is that handled? Do they have insurance? Are they help with that, or how does that happen?
Yeah, so there's a program through the state of Maryland that actually covers any forensic exam. It used to just be for sexual assault exams. It's now for domestic violence exams as well. So it does cover all of those costs. The tricky part is if that victim decides at any point, I no longer want to collect evidence, I just want to get medical attention, then it gets a little more tricky because they will have to do either self-pay or insurance, which if they fall back on insurance, there's always a safety issue behind it. We always want to make sure that the person holding the insurance isn't the abusive partner, and they're not going to see that victim went to the hospital and had all of these medical tests done and things like that. So there's definitely even safety planning around that if they choose not to get a forensic exam.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Shannon, it's Ann
Hey.
Gill. So I have a couple of questions. One, and I might have missed this, how many medical MAs are on staff?
So we typically have between 11 and 12, and they usually fulfill about 40 hours a month. And that completely fills our calendar so that we're fully staffed and covered.
And what's kind of the demarcation point between the MA and the forensic nurse? Is really the forensic nurse's role to collect evidence. And then, as you said, the MA is really more of that advocate, that that resource for all things, next steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But we do work together a lot when it comes to advocating for next steps for if they need shelter placement or transportation to go file a protective order, things like that. We're always consistently working really closely with the forensic nurse, especially to make sure that we're all on the same page and offering that victim really what they need.
And my last question is, so you said the MA follows up with the victim. So it's the MA, it's actually not another social worker on staff. It's the MA that kind of sticks with that victim.
So good question. So if our medical accompaniment advocate also works as a crisis worker on our hotline, we will have that specific person follow up with them because they've already built rapport and connection with that victim. If they don't work on our crisis hotline, it's usually our medical accompaniment coordinator who follows up with them, and they'll still do all the same work with them during that call. So they'll again offer services, education, safety planning. Again, we do a lot of the same work in our follow-up calls that we do initially with them, because most of the time, again, that victim at the hospital is usually kind of in trauma brain. So we have to kind of remind them and go over a lot of the same information that we went over with them the first time in those follow-up calls.
Thank you.
Sure.
Shannon, there's a question in the chat about how often we respond to victims who don't speak English, and how does that work?
So I would probably say, on average, we have about 2 to 3 per month that are non-English speaking. And we can kind of handle those a few different ways. We can use what they call at the hospital the blue phone and use their language line if we don't have an interpreter immediately available. But the hospital has now, typically they'll bring up an interpreter to us immediately. And we're able to actually use that interpreter also because we're a contractor of the hospital. So we usually have an interpreter readily accessible.
I'm gonna wait for somebody else. Nikki, can I jump in?
Absolutely,
One more question.
absolutely.
I'm sure this doesn't come up often, but I know that it does happen. What about for male victims? Do you have MAs that are of that gender or
We
not?
don't currently. I'd like to add that at some point in the program, but it may be a little tricky just to make sure that that male is always available anytime there would be a male victim. But we have trained all of our other staff who are female gender to just be mindful and careful about working with those males as far as making sure that we are, again, consistently asking for consent through every single part, especially the physical exam. Most of the time, if there is a physical exam, we won't sit in unless the nurse needs us for whatever reason. And if they do need us, again, we're double checking about that consent.
Children different.
When the victim's a child, Shannon, is the parent generally in the room as well?
Not usually for the exam, but for everything else they are.
Well, we're coming up on 9 o'clock. And so I want to be respectful of everyone's time and thank you all so much for making the time to come and hear a little bit more about our work in this. There's a lot that happens at Hartley House, as you now are seeing, kind of from the beginning of an incident through someone's journey of recovery. And Shannon and her team are there at the start. It's really incredible work and I'm so grateful. We're also grateful for Shannon's leadership and the training and the good work that her team does. And I'm excited to be able to share it with you because of your support, we're able to do this work and continue to do it and be there for every victim. So thank you so much. And just a reminder, we'll have another briefing in February for you guys. And with our fingers crossed, looking at the sky for all the best, we'd like to have an in-person event and be able to bring you all together in April. So more information about that after the first of the year. But again, thank you so much for your support of Hartley House and our work and our clients. And thank you for making the time to come today. Share this with other people. We're going to go ahead and record it. Actually, we did record it. And we'll send you all a link to that recording. If you want to share that with anyone, you're more than welcome to do so. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great
Thanks
day.
very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Good job.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.